How's it going, everyone? I'm Motive Games, and today we're going to be going over one of my favorite builds currently, Holy Trail Paladin. This is a build that focuses on fire damage and damage over time as our primary stat focuses, and has a very forgiving playstyle with a very easy barrier to entry, but lots of room to improve with different utility combos. If you enjoy builds with downtime, allowing you to focus on repositioning to dodge attacks, or a more hit and run playstyle, or throw and forget, then this build is perfect for you. To start, we'll introduce the two key parts of the build. First, Javelin Toss. With the Keystone Holy Trail, this node causes the Javelin to leave behind a trail of fire and lightning that deals damage over time to enemies or heals allies who happen to be in its way. For our second ability, we'll be using Judgment with its secondary effect Consecrated Ground. For a second damage over time effect that also acts as an emergency source of healing for our build if it needs to be. For our buffs, we'll be using Holy Aura and Sigils of Hope, granting us a large variety of buffs such as damage resistances and healing effectiveness. Our final skill for this build will be Volatile Reversal. This is a utility skill that can be both an important defensive tool for bossing as well as our burst phase. For true mastery of this build, proper usage of the skill is going to be very important going forward. As a quick note, for those of you who would prefer to follow along with a more traditional guide instead of a video, I've prepared a build planner down below in the description for you to use. To see where I put each passive and skill point, just navigate to the tree or skill in question and slide the orange bar at the bottom to your respective level. Make sure, if you are going to close out the video, to leave a comment and like it. It's very helpful. And with that, let's move on to the skill trees. First, move on to Javelin Toss. You're going to start by putting 1 point into Mighty Delivery, 1 point into Burning Strength, 2 points into Spirit to the Thigh, then 1 point into Holy Trail. This gets the build online, so to speak. From there, we're going to go ahead and put 3 more points into Spirit of the Thigh, 1 point in Path of Judgment. This is so that we will be scaling both our Consecrated Ground on Judgment and Holy Trail while putting points into healing effectiveness, instead of waiting after we do Pilgrimage, which 4 points into Pilgrimage. From here, 1 point and go for the legs, and we're going to follow this line down from Keen Outlook, Forceful Hurl, all the way to Strategic Patience. As a note, we don't really care too much about Forceful Hurl here. We don't really do any massive physical pin, and we don't do any lightning damage. So this is mostly just a node for us to get through. Don't ever worry about standing still just to get benefit from these effects, because it'll basically do nothing for you. Once that's done, fill out the rest of your points into Mighty Delivery, and that should be good. Next, Judgment. We're going to go ahead and start on Judgment with 2 points into Sacred Sword, and then 1 point into Pious Offering. Now, Pious Offering is going to be a little tricky here. Anytime you use a Judgment, it will consume 20% of your mana for bonus damage. So there is some reason to stack mana in this build, but the important thing you want to know is to not be spamming this on cooldown. You want to make sure that you're casting Judgment basically when you need to. You could use it anytime you're mostly fighting enemies, but don't be using it just to have the Consecrated Ground active for no reason. You will burn through your mana, which will ultimately lower your damage effectiveness. You want to try to stay topped off on mana as much as you can. In some situations, you will need to cast a second Judgment before your mana is kind of topped off again, or maybe you need to cast Sigils. Things happen, but be mindful of your mana while using this. With your 1 point in Pious Offering, we're going to move over now to Swift Verdict and put 2 points here. After that, 4 points into Flaming Soul. This gives us 100% multiplicative, and then 4 points into Purifying Flame. Both of these will make sure that we're doing as much damage as possible with as little stat investment. At this point, you will probably notice that Judgment feels a little clunky to use sometimes. You drop it down, and enemies will move out of it, or maybe things just die so quickly. Maybe you didn't place it right. And that's why, for my version of the build currently, we are going to put in 2 points to Sanctified Serenity, 2 points into Lingering Force, a little bit of duration is always nice, and 1 point into Anointed. This is totally optional. You could absolutely cut Anointed. This will give you a lower cooldown duration, which can be nice, but it'll also allow you to take these 5 points and put them elsewhere. Perhaps you wanted to put them in Deliverance to give yourself a better mana consumption for it. Maybe you put them in Divine Destruction or Scourge Bane. So if you feel like you don't care about the quality of life of having the circle of Consecrated Ground attached to you and being able to move, then by all means, bypass these 5 points, place them elsewhere. but if you have used them, go ahead and put 2 points in Destructive Impact, and that should fill out your tree. Next, Holy Aura. I will say this one's not too important. You can take a lot of liberties with this if you would like. If there's a specific node you want to try out, feel free to do it. The only ones that I recommend that are very important are 1 point into Rhea's Destruction, 2 points into Rhea's Fury for a pin, and then 5 points into Burning Blows to get that 50% global increased fire damage. From here, you could put either 5 points into Shelter the Storm early if you feel like you have really bad resistances. You could put some points into Vital Boon and Redemption to get yourself some increased healing effectiveness, which will buff your damage, and healing regen, also keeping you alive. Or you could look to branch out into other areas, such as increasing your attack speed or cast speed. You could mess around with Flame Burst if you feel like you want to, but for the most part, I would say this is standard enough and there's not much reason to deviate here. Next, we'll go into Sigils of Hope, the second buff. Starting here, we're going to go ahead and put 4 points into Empowering Sigils and then 1 point into Last Wish. We will then put 1 more point in Empowering Sigils and then max out Decree of Flame. This gives us a flat damage, or not flat, a percentage damage bonus for each sigil, as well as a flat damage per sigil then. And lastly, we'll have a chance to cast Sigil on kill. This is going to be very important as Sigil gets very costly, and being able to cheat Sigils essentially as we clear mobs will help us keep uptime on this. I will say it's not so important when you're mapping that it's important to keep 100% uptime, but against bosses it will be a drastic increase to your damage. From there, we'll put 2 points into Iron Sigils, 4 points into Enduring Hope, 1 point into Tetragram, fill out that last point of Enduring Hope. Duration is going to be extremely important. There's no point in constantly casting sigils if they're not lasting a long time. And Tetragram also giving you that 4th sigil for just a little bit extra oomph to the build. 2 points to Invigorate after that, and then 1 point into Quiet Mind to help ease the mana burden from this ability. Lastly, we'll go into Volatile Reversal. For this one, there's a couple ways you could go about it. If you want Volatile Reversal up as often as possible, I recommend going 2 points into Time Sap and then 1 point into Time Lost Vitality. However, if you feel like you can play around with the lower cooldown and want to get your value immediately, then you'll put 1 point into Incipient Void Rift, 3 points into Disintegration, and then go ahead and put 3 points into Time Rift. This will give us 60% increased enemy damage over time effects, enemies taking damage from damage over time effects, and this is where a lot of our damage increase is going to be from this ability. Next, we'll put 1 point into Terminal Void Rift, 3 points into Dark Expanse, 3 points into Harbinger of Dust. Very similar effect, but not limited to damage over time. So that will end up being somewhere close to 90% increased damage for us just for hitting someone with Void Rift. From there, we'll go ahead and do the 2 points in Sign Sap and 1 point into Time Lost Vitality like we said. If you've already done that, put 2 points into Traveler's Fatigue. This is more cooldown recovery speed. We will lose health regen, but that's okay considering the amount of healing we have in this build. And lastly, 1 point into Catching Up. The bonus movement speed can be very important as it can be sometimes hard to remember where Volatile Reversal is going to take you, since it does send you back in time to where you were 2 seconds ago. This means it will revert your mana, which you can use to cheat back a whole bunch of mana after maybe dumping all of it into sigils and then casting a Consecrated Ground. Keeping that in mind, the movement speed is helpful for repositioning out of those tricky spots we may put ourselves into. Alright, and now for the passive tree. We're going to go ahead and start with 5 points into Fearless, 1 point into Stalwart, 5 points into Armor Clad, 6 points into Relentless, and 3 points into Fearless. Now, the reasoning why we grabbed Stalwart may be a little odd to some people, but flat 3% block chance is actually fairly good. It's very hard to get a flat amount of block chance, especially a decent amount like this, so we go ahead and spend the 1 passive point as I think it's pretty worth it. The only other place we'd end up putting it is Relentless anyways, and that 5% damage I don't think is anywhere close to as effective. Especially considering we will be using a shield with this build. Moving on from here, we'll go to Paladin. 1 point into Honor for the same exact reason, flat 2% block chance, and then we're going to go ahead and put 8 points into Conviction. With that out of the way, we will go ahead and put 1 point into Valor, as I don't think it's worth putting any more into Honor for now. 10 points into Heaven Fire, and then 5 points into Prayer. And this is where the first big decision gets to be made in the passive tree. Playing at this point, if you feel like your damage is high enough, then you can go ahead and start putting into defensive traits. However, if you feel like your damage is too low, you can go ahead and put 5 points into prayer. For the sake of this video though, we will continue along with defensive traits and put 5 points into faith armor. Crit strike avoidance is an important stat line that you cannot ignore, and 25% of it is pretty nice. We will be maxing it out later, so don't worry. But for now, we have our judgment, so let's come over to the void tree to grab our last ability. We'll go ahead and put 5 points into abyssal endurance. This will give us some void resist and physical resistance if you happen to be missing that, and unlock volatile reversal. Now that that's done, we're going to come back over to the Paladin tree. If you put 5 points of the faith armor, we're going to go ahead and put it into prayer. Otherwise, you'll put the 5 points of the faith armor that you did earlier. With that done, we're going to go ahead and put 3 points into faith armor, 1 point into sanctuary guardian, and 1 point into shield wall. 5 points into reverence of duality to get a little bit of increase everywhere, and then dump everything to Librea. By far one of the best passive nodes that we have. We want to make sure that we're taking advantage of that. We've got a little bit of extra spots to use things now, so we're going to go ahead and max out Holy Icon. The increased healing effectiveness will give us some good value everywhere. We'll go ahead and max out Reverence of Duality, and then for the last bit, same as before. If you feel like you need a little bit more damage, you can go ahead and put 7 points into our Sanctuary Guardian and keep it simple. However, if you need a little bit more physical and void resistance, you can put 5 points here. And then 1 point into Steel Aegis is always very helpful as well. This will give you 2% extra block chance, and we can always use more of that. With that 1 point left over, let's go ahead and put it in Sanctuary Guardian. Now, with all of that way, let's start with the inventory. For Exalteds, it can be a little tricky looking for the exact lines you want, but forging is going to be very important to make sure you have something usable. Nearly every piece of gear you see here has some amount of forging done to it. 13, 1, 0, 0. This is going to be the most important thing when it comes to making sure that you actually have usable gear. So make sure that you're tagging the important lines you're going to need on your loot filter to both shatter them or to hopefully find bases that will be good for forging. The most important lines for this build are going to be, in order, fire damage over time, elemental damage over time, and damage over time. A rule of thumb in this game is the more specific the modifier, the better it's going to be. This is why fire damage over time is going to be the best for us, though with how as rare as it is, you'll likely be settling for mostly elemental damage over time as a close second place. For the rest though, it's important to make sure that you have either boots or belts with tier 6 cooldown recovery speed. This is going to make sure that you're hitting a nice breakthrough to be able to have 2 spear throws up consistently, and from there you're just going to want to make sure that you're able to get enough crit strike avoidance to put you in that 100% range. Currently you can see we're at 161%, so we're well over it, and we could use to take some of that out of our build for more things like health. Everything else will be focused on shoring up your defenses as best as possible through health, armor, and resistances. Though do make sure not to try to not go over 75% resistances, as there is no benefit for that in our current setup, but it is okay to wear them if it means getting some important stat lines in the meantime. Moving on from them, don't fret too much when it comes to getting perfect gear. As you can tell from mine, there are many forms of improvements we can have. I'm wearing a rare glove and a relic after all. Any good Exalted would end up being able to replace them, but sadly I just haven't been able to find one in this time. From that, we'll look at idols. Most of my idol slots are dedicated to defensive purposes. As you can see here, we're running 15% crit strike chance. This is a worthless line on this build, because damage over time cannot crit. But we want that 23 health. So you can see we've got health, poison resistance. The only one that's not similar to the rest of these is going to be this 31% increased armor. I find this one to be very valuable. As you can see, it buffs us up an extra 4%, and in a lot of cases that can be difficult to find. But using this area to round out the rest of these resistances and hopefully slap in more health is the best way for me to do it at the moment. Now, for long-term upgrades on this build, there are a few uniques that I will recommend, but I'm going to go ahead and say there's a lot of room to work with in this build. If you find a piece of gear that you think may be helpful, try it, because there's a good chance that it may be better than what you're currently wielding. Good Exalteds will often beat uniques, but there are a few, such as Stymied Fate, that I think it'd be hard to beat. Stymied Fate, for the most part, isn't anything too groundbreaking, but 125% damage over time effect on a pair of boots is something that you're really just not going to find anywhere else. So it's a nice pair of boots to squeeze out a little bit of extra damage. Next is Atrophy. For the most part, we don't care about any of the lines on here. 7% increased cast speed is nice, and 32 armor isn't really anything too big. As you can see, we're even losing armor. But 20% pin is pretty huge considering all of our damage is over time, so we're going to go ahead and use that as well. For the chest piece and headpiece, we use the Sunforged set. This is because these give us a massive amount of armor. We're at 3100, 62%, throw these on, almost 5k with 73% mitigation. This alone, I feel like, is pretty nice to use it. However, they do give us a little bit of extra bonuses, being that we'll be able to spawn weapons whenever we're hit, and each weapon will give us a little bit of damage over time. It's not uncommon to see 2 to 3 weapons get spawned in the middle of a boss fight for a slight damage increase. Not anything you'll ever notice, but it is helpful. Relics are a little interesting for me. At the moment, I feel like Ashes or of... I'm not even going to bother saying this. The flower is pretty solid. It's got a 90% increase to fire damage, and the 55% health regen is also kind of nice too to give us a little bit of survivability in bosses. However, I think that a well-rolled code of the Erase Sentinel would actually end up outpacing this. 28% armor mitigation applying to your damage over time, with all the percent modifiers we're adding on to this, doesn't end up being too much different from the 90% increase to physical and fire damage. But +1 to Sentinel skills is pretty large. Just being able to put this on and add an extra skill point to these abilities can end up doing so much for us that it's definitely worth it. And with good lines, this could end up being drastically better if this had rolled damage over time effects, percent health, anything that would actually have been usable instead of something like spell crit, cold damage. This would be insanely better, and there wouldn't even be a consideration. I haven't seen too much else that I actually care for when it comes to dropping. There's no rings that I'm looking out for. There are a few different shields, but the big one, I meant to pull this out earlier, is Rhea's Light. However, it's very rare. This is the only shield that ends up giving any kind of increased damage to this build, since we're almost strictly fire damage. We don't really do anything physical related, but other shields can end up being helpful. I was using Soul Bastion and Thornshell for a while. I even ended up using the Pillar for a long time. Wherever that is, it's lost in my inventory at the moment. But Rhea's Light does end up giving us a nice little bonus of damage and another +1 to Judgment, letting us round out some of these abilities. Now, for the most part, that's going to be it, but we are going to go over a few little tips and tricks for the build. A big thing is going to be using your Spear Throw on cooldown. This ability does stack. As you can see, we're able to get a decent amount of spears out, able to do a consistent bit. If we had these boots on from earlier, we could actually end up getting 3 separate lines out and increase our damage by a massive amount, as you can see here, hitting 92,000. Guess a dummy, but... Secondly is going to be good use of Volatile Reversal. One of the best ways that I like to do this is go ahead and just cast everything and cast your Volatile Reversal after getting your Judgment off. If you could squeeze this out a little bit better, you could actually end up getting a full mana restoration. It might just be better to go ahead and do 3 sigils, but getting your mana back full will allow you to constantly keep your Judgment uptime up. What we talked about though before with the mana, as you can see, as long as I'm pacing out my Judgment and not just using it again all willy-nilly, we're able to be pretty fine up. And the last important piece I'm going to give you is going to be, when farming monoliths, honestly, don't even bother with Volatile Reversal. Go ahead and throw on Shield Rush. Since we're using a shield, we can use this ability and not have to worry about it. It is going to be a pretty big mana expense, but being able to run through the monoliths at an increased rate can help your farming speed quite a bit. And since there's going to be a lot of situations where you've got Judgment up as you're running by, enemies are just going to die anyways. So that's going to be it for this build. If you liked it, make sure to drop a follow, leave a comment, and we'll be live on Twitch, likely playing this in the next few days if you want to see it in action. Thanks for everyone for being here. Peace out.